It was a machine born of doubt, a creature of metal and oil that everyone swore would fail. The Grumman TBF Avenger, a new U.S. Navy torpedo bomber, lumbered onto the deck, its presence immediately challenging every accepted notion of naval air power. It was too heavy, its frame a burden of armor and equipment. Its wingspan, they complained, was too vast for the delicate geometry of a carrier deck, a folding behemoth that demanded too much space, too much attention. To the seasoned pilots and pragmatic engineers who walked its shadow, its design was simply overly complex. They looked at the great ventral turret, at the mass of the engine cowling, at the sheer, unforgiving size of the aircraft, and they shook their heads. It didn't look sleek. It didn't look fast. It smelled of ambition, yes, the bold arrogance of a designer pushing limits, but it also carried the metallic tang of a spectacular, costly failure waiting to happen. Before its first major test, before the oil had truly burned hot in its massive engine over the endless blue, the whispers in the hangars were unanimous, a low, collective indictment echoing between the bulkheads. It was a liability. They remembered the light, agile frames of the older bombers, machines built for speed and quick strikes. The Avenger was neither. They expected it to be slow, clumsy, and fragile, a coffin on a hook, destined to be swatted from the sky by nimble Zeros, its three-man crew condemned by its own engineering. But history, that cold, unforgiving judge of men and machines, was already preparing a revelation. The man behind the vision, the quiet engineers at Grumman, had built a beast designed not just to fly, but to endure. Where others saw excess, they had seen necessity. The heavy weight? It was armor plating designed not to deflect, but to absorb the punishing fury of enemy cannon fire and still bring its crew home. The overcomplicated central turret wasn't a frivolous extra. It was a powered, rotating nest of machine guns, a savage sting that turned the lumbering bomber into a fearsome defensive platform. The pilots assigned to it in those early days felt the skepticism like a physical weight. Every takeoff, every practice run was performed under the gaze of men who had already written the Avengers' epitaph. It was too much plane, too many moving parts. It demanded too much horsepower, too much fuel, too much faith. Then came the first light of battle, the sudden, terrible violence that instantly separates genius from folly. The first handful of Avengers thrown into the fray at Midway were decimated, fulfilling the darkest prophecies. 6 planes went out. Only 1 returned. See? The doubters might have cried. We told you it was a failure. A single brutal day seemed to confirm the deep, ingrained conviction that the complex must always bow to the simple, the heavy to the fast. But the war was not won in a single day or by a single machine. It was won in the brutal, grinding attrition that followed across the endless stretch of the Solomons and the terrifying expanse of the Pacific. And it was here, in the years of prolonged, desperate fighting, that the truth began its slow, inevitable ascent. The Avenger, that overcomplicated design, that great heavy beast of a bomber, would not just survive the crucible of war. It would dominate it. It would secure the highest kill ratio of any American combat plane in the entire conflict, not merely among bombers, but among all U.S. aircraft, including the elite fighters built specifically for aerial combat. How could a torpedo bomber, a slow target designed to drop a heavy payload and flee, achieve such a staggering, paradoxical record? The whispers were wrong, dead wrong. The very traits that critics condemned, its rugged complexity, its protective mass, its immense defensive firepower, were the traits that forged its terrible, unparalleled success. The heavy frame that made it clumsy on the runway also made it a near-indestructible force in the sky. It survived. And because it survived, its crew often had the time, the chance, the vengeance to ensure that their attackers did not. This was the quiet genius of the design, the profound realization that a plane's effectiveness is not measured by its speed in the attack, but by its capacity to live through the counterattack. The complexity was its shield. The shield became its weapon. The Avenger was not born of consensus. It was born of a deep, almost obstinate conviction in a handful of engineers huddled in the chilly vastness of the Grumman plant on Long Island. They were men who had seen the war coming, men who knew the fragile limitations of the older planes, machines designed for a war that no longer existed. Their vision, quiet and unyielding, stood in stark contrast to the loud, prevailing opinions of naval procurement. They fought for the overcomplicated features because they understood a simple, terrifying truth. The Pacific was an ocean of no return. Survival could not be an afterthought. It had to be the central pillar of the design. Look closely at the blueprints. See the sheer volume dedicated to the massive bomb bay, large enough to swallow the Navy's immense new Torpedo. This was not just about delivery. It was about protecting that explosive payload until the very last moment, keeping it internal, shielded from flak that could detonate a premature disaster. Where others saw a drain on speed, they saw an insurance policy. And then there was the power turret. It sat like a glass citadel high on the fuselage, housing a single, terrifying .50 caliber machine gun. To the traditionalists, this heavy motor-driven mechanism was pure excess, a frivolous complexity that added drag and weight. But the designers saw the terrible vulnerability of the pilot facing a rear attack, forced to rely on a manually operated gun. The power turret was an act of faith in the gunner, a commitment to giving him the mechanized force needed to fight back, to truly defend his cockpit and his two companions. It was heavy, yes, it was complex, absolutely. But it represented the only way to transform a target into a hunter. The airframe itself was a contradiction, famously rugged, built with the toughness of a Grumman ironworks machine. Every rivet, every structural brace was over-engineered, prepared for the kind of brutal, sustained damage that would simply shatter a lighter aircraft. They built it to take a punch, believing that getting the pilot home, bleeding but intact, was the single most vital specification. This quiet, focused intensity on survival defined the TBF's troubled genesis. It was a design fighting its own Navy for acceptance, a concept based on grim realism battling the allure of speed and lightness. But the clock was ticking, the shadow of Pearl Harbor was long, and necessity finally triumphed over skepticism. The first production models rolled out, heavy and purposeful, bound for the Pacific. The tension culminated on the morning of June 4, 1942, at the Battle of Midway. The Avengers, fresh from the production line, still smelling of new paint and raw ambition, were hastily launched from the decks of Midway Atoll. This was their baptism of fire, the moment of reckoning. 6 aircraft, 6 crews. They roared into the sky, inexperienced pilots flying an unproven machine, tasked with a desperate attack against the massive Japanese fleet. The result was a disaster so swift, so complete, it seemed to confirm every prior doubt. They were met by the terrifying swarm of Japanese Zeros, agile and practiced. The Avenger's vaunted speed was no match. Its sheer size made it an easier target. The skies erupted with tracers. Within minutes, 5 of the 6 TBFs were shot down, collapsing into the endless, indifferent ocean. One plane limped back, shattered and bleeding, the sole survivor of the debut mission. The numbers were chilling, devastating. A 5-to-1 loss rate on its first day. The profound grief that settled over the American command was tinged with bitter resignation. The critics had been right. The heavy, overcomplicated bomber was a failure, a coffin on a hook. The casualties were not just statistics. They were names, men who had placed their faith in this new machine. The reports filtering back were chilling, confirming the perception of a design fundamentally unsuited for the brutal tempo of aerial combat. But those early terrible losses, that moment of abject, visible failure, ironically set the stage for the narrative's deepest truth. The true measure of any design, particularly one meant for war, is not in its features on paper or even in its initial showing, but in its survival and lethality over time. The Avenger had taken a blow that would have crippled any other aircraft's reputation. Yet, as the war ground on, as the lessons of Midway were absorbed, that one returned plane held the subtle, unheeded secret of the Avenger's future. It was a machine that might lose the battle, but was built stubbornly and resiliently to win the war. The shadow of Midway was long, but the war waited for no one's mourning. The Avenger was rushed into the protracted grinding meat grinder of the island-hopping campaigns, replacing the tragically outmatched Devastator. It was in the endless, humid skies above the Solomons, amidst the stinging rain and the blinding chaos of close-quarters naval war, that the TBF began its slow, grim climb toward legitimacy. Initially, the transition was marked by grudging necessity. Pilots didn't love the Avenger. They were simply stuck with it. They missed the familiar, lighter feel of the older planes, yet they could not deny the immediate, terrifying reality of the enemy. The Japanese Zeros were fast, they were brutal, and they made short work of anything less than heavily armored. It was here that the contrast began to sharpen, not between the Avenger and its blueprints, but between the Avenger and its predecessors. The older planes took a single, well-placed burst and were gone, a flash, a plunge, a swift watery burial. But the Avenger? It was a sledgehammer of a machine, built by the Grumman engineers with a clear-eyed expectation of violence. The engine screamed, the cockpit rattled. Flak bursts were sudden, jarring impacts, tearing through the airframe. Tense. The pilot felt the jolt, the shuddering deceleration, the sickening sound of metal being violently peeled back. He checked his instruments. He pushed the throttle. It was still flying. The heavy, rugged construction, once criticized as a design flaw, was now a life preserver. The planes would return to the carrier decks looking less like aircraft and more like meticulously perforated colanders. Holes in the wings, holes in the fuselage, hydraulic lines severed, but the pilot and his crew, sweating and white-knuckled, would climb out. They were home. They lived. This was the silent, profound shift in perception. The Avenger's engine, derided for the fuel it consumed and the weight it added, proved astonishingly reliable, even when wounded. It was the heart of the great beast, refusing to quit when it had every statistical reason to die. The pilot started to realize that every unnecessary pound of armor, every complicated feature, translated directly into an extra minute of flight. The difference between ditching and landing, between survival and loss. Reflective. Hours later, leaning on the rail, watching the dawn break over the endless, unforgiving sea, the young gunner would look back at the jagged tears in his turret armor. A millimeter less steel, a slightly weaker weld, and he would have been swallowed by the waves. His survival was not luck, it was engineering. The rhythm of combat changed because of the Avenger's durability. The enemy, accustomed to targets that disintegrated, was suddenly facing a plane that returned fire even as it bled oil. The three crewmen, protected by the heavy glass and mechanized force of the power turret, fought back with terrifying effectiveness. This resilience began to sow a new kind of doubt in the ranks of the Zero pilots. Attacking the Avenger was not a swift kill. It was a protracted engagement, one that often cost the attacker more than the target. The realization crystallized over the skies of Guadalcanal and Tarawa. The highest kill ratio doesn't belong exclusively to the fastest fighter. It belongs to the plane that ensures its crew survives the engagement, that turns the tide of the fight by the sheer stubbornness of its return fire. Survivability, the ability to keep the gunners alive and the guns firing, was not a luxury. It was the foundation of lethality. The Avenger was complex because life itself is complex, and the task of preserving 3 human lives through the fire of aerial combat demanded redundancy, mass, and power. The very excess that the critics scorned was the price of survival. It was a slow, grim lesson, paid for in blood and delivered in the constant rhythmic thump of heavily damaged planes finally settling onto the deck. It wasn't fast, it wasn't beautiful, but by God, it came home, and in doing so, it became the terror of the Pacific. The years bled into campaigns. The battles became not individual acts of glory, but a grinding statistical war of attrition. The pilots knew what their heavy, loyal plane could do, having felt the flak explode around them and heard the sigh of relief when the damaged airframe responded to the controls. But the final absolute judgment of war is rendered not in the subjective fear of the pilot's logbook, but in the cold, unforgiving columns of the statistician. This is where the truth, devastating and precise, finally waited. The contrast, so long a source of deep internal tension, was about to shatter the naval aviation establishment's preconceived notions. The final numbers arrived, stripped bare of emotion, yet possessing a terrible, profound poetry. It was never about the sheer volume of enemy planes shot down by the Avenger. It was about something far more vital: efficiency. It was the ratio, the number of confirmed enemy kills versus the number of Avengers lost to hostile aircraft. This ratio was not merely impressive, it was, in the entire operational roster of American aviation, unrivaled. The Avenger, the lumbering, overcomplicated 3-man torpedo bomber, secured the highest kill ratio of any U.S. combat aircraft. A torpedo bomber, the ultimate statistical anomaly. The doubters had measured success by agility and speed, metrics for a clean, quick fight. The Grumman designers, having faced the grim future, had measured success by resilience and retribution. The very complexity that had fueled the early skepticism was the architecture of this devastating truth. The Avenger's primary stated role was to deliver the torpedo. That was its destiny, its function. But its unwritten mission, the one the critics dismissed as excessive, was self-preservation. That heavy motorized power turret, the feature they mocked as an unnecessary drain on performance, was the epicenter of the plane's success. It housed a fearsome 50-caliber weapon, capable of issuing a constant, disciplined, unforgiving stream of fire that turned the bomber's 6 o'clock position into a lethal no-fly zone. The Japanese Zero pilots, accustomed to diving on American bombers and finding soft, manual defenses that crumbled under pressure, encountered something new. They attacked the Avenger, expecting the easy, blazing kill they had grown accustomed to. Instead, they met a machine that simply refused to die. Every extra piece of metal, every pound of armor, contributed to a crucial psychological and operational outcome. The enemy pilot could not count on the kill. They were forced to maintain their attack longer, often within the punishing arc of the 50-caliber gun. The Avenger didn't dogfight. It didn't maneuver with grace. It simply sat there, absorbing the punishment and firing back with mechanized, terrifying precision. The bomber was built tough enough to ensure that the gunner, even under heavy attack, could keep his sight steady and his finger on the trigger. This meant the Avenger was lost at a terrifyingly low rate, which mathematically inflated its kill ratio far beyond that of its more fragile contemporaries. It defended itself better than almost anything else the Americans flew, and in the unforgiving equation of war, defense that forces the enemy to break off or crash is offense. The contrast finally resolved, the complex design was, in fact, the shield that secured its highest kill ratio. It was the difference between a machine that finished its torpedo run and plunged into the sea, and a machine that finished its run, killed its attacker in the defensive exchange, and limped home. The Avenger wasn't just a bomber, it was an incredibly resilient platform for a crew determined to survive. Its triumph was not in superior offense, but in superior, stubborn defense. The overcomplicated genius of its structure proved that in the crucible of extended war, the ability to endure, the capacity to bring the men home to fight another day, is the only metric that truly matters. The highest kill ratio belonged to the plane that simply wouldn't quit. The war finally concluded, not with a sudden clean break, but with the slow, agonizing realization that the great consuming violence was done. The Avenger, that heavy, stubborn beast of the air, finally rested on the deck. Its operational life had spanned the entire brutal length of the Pacific conflict, from the smoking wreckage of its debut at Midway to the final grim sorties over Japan. And in its wake, it left a legacy measured not just in tonnage sunk, but in the profound metrics of survival. Its endurance became legendary. The Avenger became the platform of the most decorated pilots, the most relentless attacks, and the most consistent success. It was the machine that flew future President George H.W. Bush into the fire, and it was the airframe that carried the atomic weapon components for the Trinity test. Its career was a continuous, powerful testament to the original, much-maligned vision that in an environment of total war, redundancy is reality and complexity is capacity. We look back now, decades later, and see the lesson etched into the bullet-riddled airframes preserved in museums. True genius in design often looks like overkill to those confined by the present moment, those who refuse to imagine the worst possible scenario. The critics of 1941 saw a heavy, unnecessary burden. The surviving crews of 1945 saw salvation in that same weight. The TBF Avenger proved with undeniable statistical finality that complexity is not always inefficiency. Sometimes it is the absolute prerequisite for reliability and superior performance in the face of the unknown. A simpler plane would have been faster, yes, but faster only until it was hit. The complexity of the power turret, the heavy gauge of the steel, the sheer mass of the plane, these elements built a platform that could absorb damage, allow its crew to fight back, and, crucially, stay in the fight long enough to deliver its weapon and secure its own future. The highest kill ratio was not a fluke of battle. It was the direct, inevitable result of a design philosophy that placed the grim, enduring necessity of survival above the glamorous pursuit of speed. The engineers at Grumman did not design a graceful plane. They designed a lifeboat encased in armor, armed with vengeance. And that is the quiet, poignant insight the Avenger offers to us now. Beyond the battles and the bloodshed, its story forces a universal reflection on the countless forgotten lives saved by a machine that was built not for flashy performance, but for the fundamental human act of enduring. We live in a world that consistently celebrates simplicity and sleekness, where any hint of overcomplicated structure is met with immediate dismissal. But what if the complex, the rigorous, the heavy layer of protection is what we truly need? What if the features we label as excess today are the very things required to weather the storm we haven't yet seen? The question lingers, hanging in the air like the echo of a forgotten engine. What other profound, necessary truths do we dismiss in our own time simply because they look too difficult? The legacy of the Avenger demands that we examine our skepticism, reminding us that sometimes the deepest faith is found in the heaviest armor.